One of the first practical steps you will take is to gather and consecrate all of your essential tools. These tools are ancient symbols, and they help you to discover and release the immense power that is within your mind. But it's essential to understand that the tools enhance and augment the power of our mind and aid in its training. An adept can achieve remarkable results without any tools, using them just for their own enjoyment rather than out of necessity. Yet as a student of the craft, I think that these tools are very essential. Each tool represents an invisible principle or aspect of your psyche, and having the tool assists you in mastering these different aspects so that you can master your life and your craft. It's so important to remember that you do not need to spend money, or at least not a lot of money, on tools. Your tools do not need to be extravagant. And once you start developing your craft and the magic flows, you'll start manifesting things for yourself. And then you can, if you feel like it, manifest more extravagant tools if that's a desire of yours. But don't think that you need to have something extravagant in order to practice the craft, because you do not. There are etiquette rules when it comes to tools and altars very frequently. Most witches consider their tools sacred. And if you're around somebody's altar or their tools, and you know that's what they are, be aware that you are in their sacred space and avoid touching them without permission. Always ask first before you pick up a magical tool, because a lot of witches are very adamant about how their energy has been built up in that tool, and they don't want you touching them. Now, other witches don't seem to care as much. For instance, in my practice, since I'm very discreet, I don't have a witchy environment at all. I'm very under the wire. And so most of my tools, even though I will put them away in a special place, you would never look at my set of witch tools and say, oh boy, that person's practicing witchcraft. You might wonder why those things are collected together and put in a cabinet, but you'd never think, ooh, I'm in somebody's witch chest, because that's just how I like it. I like it rather stealth. So if somebody were to pick up one of my tools, it doesn't bother me personally, but that's just me. Not all witches are the same, and you may want to take care when you're around other people's tools. When I started out, and it is the case even to this day to some degree, I just repurposed items. I didn't go out and buy new things because I didn't have the money. I was young, I was a kid, I didn't have a lot of money, and I really wanted to start. So my first Athame was just a knife that we had in the kitchen. I painted the handle black. And back then I used to paint runes right on my tools, which I don't do anymore. And I'm going to talk to you about that later. So I just painted the handle of that kitchen knife black, and I painted my runes on it. I had a stainless steel mixing bowl, and I painted the runes on that. And I put some sand in the bottom of it, and that was my thurible. And I used that anytime I needed to burn incense or stoke small fires. We're going to talk about that in a minute as well. My first chalice, I just used a wine goblet that nobody was using that I found, and I purified that and I consecrated that. My first pentacle I made out of baker's clay, which is just flour, salt, and water, and you put it in the oven. Now, of course, you don't have to repurpose items, but I just want you to be clear. This idea that, oh, I can't practice the craft because I can't afford it is not true. You can figure it out. Even today, my chalice is a coffee mug. The bulk of my tools are just so benign and inane. You would never notice. They just blend right away. So let's go through each of these tools one at a time. So the first tool is your magical name or your witch name. That's a very intangible tool, but it's crucial. And you don't need to have a witch name if you don't want one. You don't have to. But let's look at why you might want one. Your current name holds all the thoughts that you have about yourself. So it's important that your name, when you're working the craft, be something that only represents the powerful you that's a witch. And if you go by your own name in the craft, that's fine. But you need to purify in your mind all of the personality and identity that you have wrapped up in that name. Because in the craft, the name of something is its nature. When you know something's name, that's where its power lies. And so if you associate your name with your childhood and with your neuroses and with your mistakes and with all of your history, it can be challenging to now say, I'm a powerful witch and I have the power to create what I want. I have the power to destroy what I don't want. I have the power to rise above certain situations. That can be a challenge for many people. And that's one of the reasons why a magical name can be extremely helpful. Now, there are two kinds of witch names, and some people combine them into one, and that's what I do, but some people don't. Some people have a witch name that they use when they work with other witches out in the craft. I'm known as so-and-so. It's done to protect your anonymity. The other kind of witch name is what we're talking about here, is what you call yourself when you want to bring forth your magical self that is freed from all of the baggage of your personality. Now, some people have two. They'll have a public craft name and a private craft name. I just have one craft name. I'm Ariel. That's just me. And some people don't have any of that. They just go by their name. And so that's up to you. But it's something to think about. It's not a way to escape your identity. It's just an opportunity to take control of your magical self. It acts like a key to unlock your magical self. When you speak that name or when you identify with that name, it opens that up. So to find your name is up to you. You can choose your own name that reflects whatever you consider to be powerful, whatever you consider to be magical, whatever you consider to be your magical self. You can just make it up. It can be the name of a favorite deity, hero, angel, legendary character. There's so many different ways that you can find it. Now, what I did, I just asked the goddess, I said, what is a good magical name for me? I want a good craft name. And I came up with what I thought it was, and I played with it for a while. And somebody wrote me a letter, and they misspelled it. And they said, Dear Ariel. And I thought, that's the name. There it is. And it's stuck. And it's been with me for decades. And so that can be there for you as well. You just have to be patient with that. Remember that your magical name connects you to the deepest part of your magic, the deepest part of your mind, your connection with God or the gods, with your divinity. So focus on choosing a magical name if that's something that sounds good to you. And once you've chosen it, just declare. It doesn't have to be a big ceremony, but it can be. Just declare out loud, I am so-and-so, and name yourself as that name. I'm a beautiful, powerful witch deserving happiness and success on my path, or something to that effect. The next tool is called the Athame, or the blade, or the knife. The Athame is considered to be an extension of your willpower. And if you're looking to associate it with an element, it is associated in my practice with the element of fire, which is at odds with the swords of the tarot, often used to depict the element of air. So that can be confusing to some people. And therefore, some people choose to align their Athame to the element of air. And you can. Just be aware that the consecration of the tools that I give you has the Athame belonging to fire. So you'll need to come up with a different consecration if you don't want your Athame to be consecrated to the element of fire. Just think about it though. The blade is forged in fire. It's like how it comes about is through fire. So to me, it just makes a lot of sense that it's a fire element. Athame is commonly used to direct your will and your energy in magic. It serves various purposes such as drawing magic circles, charging things like amulets or talismans, cutting psychic ties. It's one of the most frequently used tools. Traditionally, the Athame is about 5 or 6 inches long, and it's a double-edged steel blade with a black hilt or handle. Now, steel is a very good conductor of psychic energy, and the black color in the handle symbolizes the absorption of power, which means that a black handled knife absorbs the energy that you're sending to it through its handle and focuses it to a sharp point at the tip of the blade. Now, if you're drawn to a blade that deviates from the traditional specifications, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. It does not have to be double-edged. It does not have to be steel, and it does not have to have a black handle. That's just traditional. Now, I tend to go with the traditional blade myself. That's the closest thing to an out-and-out witch tool that I own. But it doesn't have anything carved or written on it. Nobody's ever asked me about it before, but there's a lot of reasons you might have a knife like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're practicing witchcraft. But there are ways if you don't want that. Now, one of the best, I think, stealth Athames is a letter opener because it's shaped just like a knife. It's made of metal. And nobody is going to say, oh no, you're a witch. Look at that letter opener. And you can even find some letter openers that are shaped like a sword and things like that. So I've always thought that was a wonderful way to have an Athame be stealth for people that didn't want to own a blade. But there's all kinds of ways that you can work around that. But the Athame is definitely considered to be one of the more important witch tools. There's two different schools of thought with the Athame. Some people say that you only use the Athame for ritual purposes. You never use it for anything mundane like cutting or carving or any of that. You just use it for directing energy. And if that's the case for you, then you'll want a second blade as a utility knife. And many people call that second utility knife a boline. And some people say that should be a white-hilted knife. Some people say it should be in the shape of a sickle. But I find if it's in the shape of a sickle, it's harder to use for things like chopping and carving. I just have one knife, and if I need to use my knife to scrape stuff or cut stuff or whatever, fine. That's how I like it. But it's up to you. If you want to have a second knife as a boline, as a utility knife, and keep your Athame just for energy work, that's an absolutely fine thing to do, and many people do just that. The next tool is called a thurible. A thurible is any kind of fireproof bowl that acts as a fire bowl. So you usually put a layer of sand or earth or something in the bottom of it and use it for burning incense and stoking up small contained fires. You can use a small chafing dish, you can use a cauldron, you can use a small casserole, you can use a small incense burner. It's got to be large enough for you to, if you need to like burn petitions or something in it, and small enough that it's not taking too much space. And the thurible is obviously associated with fire, but in magic, even though sometimes it is used to stoke up a small fire, and that's fine, its main function is to burn incense. So its main function is to produce smoke. And in that case, it's more ascribed to the element of air. Now, I don't burn things indoors anymore. I used to. Sometimes I'll burn a small alcohol fire indoors because it doesn't have a lot of smoke, but I'm done with having smoke on my paint job. And I'm done with having people come into the room hours after I've done a ritual saying, well, it smells like smoke in here. So I'm done with that. I don't burn things indoors. Plus, I don't think it's healthy to breathe incense smoke. If you are going to burn incense indoors, my recommendation is to make sure that you've got ventilation. What I have for a thurible that I use most frequently, unless I am building a small alcohol fire indoors, is an oil lamp. And it's the kind that you see where there's a small candle underneath a little bowl, and you're supposed to put water inside that bowl, and then usually you use some essential oils, a couple drops of essential oils. And what I tend to do is I put a little bit of water in that bowl, I light the candle, let the water heat up, and if I'm using incense, I'll actually put the incense right in the water, and it'll boil the incense. And when it boils the incense, I smell it. It's like a vaporizer. But most frequently, rather than using incense material, I will use an essential oil or a blend of essential oils in my thurible if I want that element there. Now, most frequently when I'm using incense, I don't burn anything. I use a spray perfume. The spray perfume, especially if it's alcohol-based, the alcohol has definitely got some air element in it. And because it's so flammable, it's got the fire element in it. And since the sprayers usually that perfume have, they're diffusers. So that diffused mist is definitely an element of air. So I use that spray perfume very frequently instead of waving incense. But there's all kinds of ways to do things. And there's nothing wrong with burning incense if you like to do it. But I always like to mention that there are alternatives as well. So that's the thurible. Now, the pentacle is usually a symbol of the earth element. And it's some sort of flat, round plate made of something natural, like wood or stone or clay or metal, even glass. Most frequently, it's got a 5-pointed star drawn on it. Now, having a plate with a 5-pointed star permanently drawn on it is appropriate for some people and inappropriate for people that will like to keep their craft private. So I have a granite cheese board that I use that you can actually draw in chalk on. And so when I want to have a pentacle, I'll just draw it in the chalk. And then when I'm done, I wipe it clean. And I've drawn the pentacle so many times on there, I don't even need to draw the pentacle anymore because I just see it with my mind's eye. So very frequently, you'll see me on videos doing stuff with my pentacle. I don't bother drawing the star anymore just because I know it's there. So there are alternatives to the pentacle than having a pentacle permanently drawn on it. Your next tool is the cord. Now, the cord is a very practical tool used for measuring and binding. Now, many traditions use the cord also as an indicator of degree or rank. They'll have the black cord maybe for a newcomer, the silver cord for a first-degree initiate, red cord for a second-degree initiate, blue cord for third, or whatever. And so if you're part of a tradition, then you'll use their coloring system. But most of us that are solitary practitioners that just want to be witches on our own, that don't want to necessarily be part of a tradition or a coven, or if we are a part of a tradition or coven that doesn't really bother with cord colors, we just have to come up with our own. Now, the most traditional color is red. So you can use red, and I'll tell you how to make it in a second. But you could use black. It's up to you. The colors or multiple colors, how you want to do your cord is just completely up to you. I've got a video on how to weave the cord. There's several different traditional cords out there. I use a 9-foot cord. Usually you want a loop at one end and a knot at the very end with a few little tassels remaining. And then you will tie knots at strategic points in the cord so that you can use it for measuring. Many people use the cord for nothing more than putting around their waist. And that's fine too. You don't need a cord. You don't have to have one, but it's a very traditional tool. There's a lot of cord magic that you can use as well, binding things with certain chants and visualizations as you're tying knots into a piece of cord to bind those things or to make them happen. Some people just use their witch cord for that. And then when the spell is done, they take the knots out. Other people like to have a special piece of twine or cording for that spell, and they don't want to use their cord for that. Okay, the next traditional witch tool is the wand. Now, the wand is frequently associated with air because of the blade being associated with fire. But in the tarot, it's usually transposed. The tarot has the wand as fire frequently, not so much because of the mundane element of fire, but from the idea of the spiritual fire bursting forth. In many of the tarot decks, the wands, especially like the Ace of Wands, is sprouting. It's budding. You can see buds on the wand. And so that represents the fire of spring in that regard. But the blade is forged in fire. But if you put the wand in fire, it's going to be ashes. It's not going to last. So it makes more logical sense to many of us for the wand, if we're going to ascribe it to an element, for it to be an air tool and the blade to be a fire tool. But there are all kinds of opinions, all kinds of arguments, and there's no law. Really be clear on that. There's no witch police. And that's something you hear me say quite frequently. You can do anything you want. It's your craft. It's nobody's business. My recommendation is that it make sense to you, what you're doing. Make sure you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, rather than being arbitrary. Otherwise, it's not very powerful. The wand is frequently used as a tool of summoning, invocation. Some people use it for casting circles as well, especially if you don't need protective border in your circle. It's more of a celebratory circle where you're just establishing a border to contain the energy. Sometimes they will decide to use the wand instead of the blade, and that's fine. Some typical woods to make the wands are fruit woods like hazel, almond, apple, but willow is very popular as well. Any wood will suffice. Some people just find a beautiful wand on the road. A tree will just give it to them. And that's happened to me several times. And I'll say, ooh, I'm going to dry this and sand it down and turn this into a pretty wand. You can have an ornate wand. If you're a woodworker, you could do things, you can carve things into it, or you can just keep it real natural and rustic. You can buy wands made from a wand maker. And this was being done long before Harry Potter fans, just so you know. There's a lot of the Harry Potter kind of wands that are out there, and that's usually what people associate a manufactured wand with. And you can use a Harry Potter wand. There's nothing wrong with that if you like it. I have used a conductor's baton for my wand before. I don't currently, but I have, the kind that symphonic conductors use, the ones made out of wood. Those work very fine. I've used a chopstick before, a beautiful chopstick. That was a wonderful wand. I've seen people use a pencil for their wand because they want to be so stealth about things. So it's really up to you. But I do have a nice wand. If somebody were to find my wand, they'd go, oh, I didn't know you were a Harry Potter fan. You know what I mean? So it would not be a big deal, I'm sure. The next tool is the Book of Shadows. Now, the Book of Shadows is a new age term. It started with Gerald Gardner. It is not an ancient term, like many people believe. It hasn't been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was born to be that as a witch tool in the 50s. So just so you know, it's fine to use the term, but just know that it is a new term. An older term is a grimoire, which means a grammar, or just a workbook, a witch's workbook. But if you want to call it the Book of Shadows, you can. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, in many traditions, the Book of Shadows is something that's given to you because it's the rules of the coven and maybe the history of the coven. And there's a lot of craft wisdom, and that's often either given to you at initiation or it's earned by you, and you have to copy out of that book. So if you're dealing with a tradition, that's a different kind of Book of Shadows. What we're talking about is something you create. It's something that you develop over time. And most of us have many books of shadows. And mine, I like it in a binder. I know it's not as witchy looking. I know it's not as magical looking as one of those beautifully bound books that looks like an old ancient manuscript. I've had many of those, and they just drive me wacky because it's permanent. I love a binder because I can take stuff out, rearrange it, put new stuff in. I love a good binder. That's my favorite Book of Shadows. That's my favorite witch's workbook. But it's up to you how you want to do it. Traditionally, it's black and silver, but it doesn't need to be. It can be a hardbound sketchbook from an art supply store. It can be an ornate book or diary that you buy, or like I say, it can be a binder. It holds all of your spells, all your ceremonies, all your recipes, all your incantations, especially the stuff that you use again and again. Many of us in the craft will have more than one. I'll have that BOS that I use again and again, but I'll also have a diary. That's easier for me to just put in a bound book because I'm not going to ever change that. It's a record of all the magic I've done. And that way, if I have trouble or if something didn't work out well, or if it did work out, I can go back and see what I did so that I can either troubleshoot it if it didn't work or make sure to repeat it if it did work. Many of us also have dream diaries for writing down our dreams. Some of us have a recipe book for potions and incenses and oils, perfumes, all that kind of stuff. So it's up to you how many books you want, but just one is sufficient. But you do want to keep a record of your magical operations, and you do want to have records of the things that you use a lot so that you can come back to it. Now, some people prefer to do all of that digitally, and I'm not averse to that. I'm really not. But I like a good hard copy of things, and I like things myself to be handwritten. To me, it just is nicer if it's handwritten, even if it's messy. Some people like a bell, especially if you're working angel magic. The bell is used to indicate the summoning of a spirit. So you want a nice sweet sounding bell. But it can also be used to punctuate things in a ritual or give nonverbal cues to other people if you're working rituals with other people. An altar. Your altar is something that is very personal. I just recommend that you start out with a cloth, traditionally a black cloth, but it can be any color depending on what you're working on. But just for your basic regular altar, black or white is traditional just because they go with anything. And then from there, usually you want to make sure that you have a representation of each element, fire, air, earth, and water. And it can be your tools, but it can be something else, especially if you need your altar to be stealth. Usually there's some candles on the altar. Frequently there's a depiction of divinity or deity, either statues for gods and goddesses or something more subtle. Many people like to have quarter candles. They'll have a yellow candle in the east, and they'll have a yellow candle in the east, a red candle in the south, a blue candle in the west, and a green candle in the north when they're doing a ritual to represent the quarters. It's optional. Many witches like to have a broom to sweep the area, to cleanse the area. A pen and ink of art. I like a fountain pen. If you have a favorite pen that you like to work with, you can consecrate and bless that if you like. But some people like an old dip pen or a quill pen, and that's traditional. I just find them very cumbersome and challenging to write with, so I prefer a fountain pen. And that's up to you. If you're burning incense, you'll want some incense charcoal. Don't use barbecue charcoal. Use the actual incense charcoal. Salt is important, usually in magic. Sea salt is my preference, but any pure salt with no additives. Epsom salts are not the same as regular salt. Iodized salt, even though technically there's something added to it, works just fine. Table salt, kosher salt, sea salt, any of that, as long as it's not like seasoned salt or something like that. Some sort of paper for talismans and things like that. Parchment is traditional, but I just like a nice high quality paper. Some witches work without any clothes. That's called being skyclad. But many of us like to work with a robe. And when you put on your robe, you're putting on your magical self. It's like your name. It can be a wonderful cue. Usually it's a black robe with a hood. But if you don't want a robe, you can always just work with your regular street clothes. There's nothing wrong with that. Paints or markers or things like that, so that if you're trying to add color to a talisman or color to anything in your craft, you might want some acrylic paints for painting things or some markers or watercolors so that you can add color to your magic. So that's it. Now, I do have a recording as part of this training already available for grounding and centering, and that's something that would be my next assignment for you, is learn how to ground and center once a day, every day. Now, since starting from last week, you should be doing at least one spiritual purification with one of the elements every day. Try to remember to consecrate your food before you eat it. I know sometimes that's hard to remember, but do your best. And maybe start thinking about collecting some of the basic witch tools, and you'll find all the consecrations for those witch tools in the handouts of A Witch's Primer. So you'll have to make sure that you are registered for the course. It's free. There's no charge for any of this, but you can download those consecrations. Now, there's a video also that you can find on how to do Hermetic Transfer. I think the name of the video is, Do I Have to Use Symbols on My Tools, or something like that. And basically what you do is, if you want to use the runes from the Greater Key of Solomon, if you want to use the runes that I provide in the consecration ceremonies on your tools, but you don't want to have them painted on there, what you do is you write those symbols out on a piece of paper, and you can burn the paper to ashes and then put the ash all over the tool. And that's called Hermetic Transfer. And if that doesn't work, if you can't burn something, then you do the opposite. Use water instead. You take that piece of paper with the runes on it and you soak it in some water. And it doesn't matter if the ink comes off of the paper. It doesn't matter. You just soak it in the water for a few minutes, and then you wash the tool down with that water and dry it off. And you've transferred the energy of those runes into your tool, and you don't have to worry about painting those runes on, because that is very exposing, having magical symbols on a tool. For some people, that's not a problem, but for other people that need to be a lot more private, the Hermetic Transfer is an easier option for them. And some people just don't want to use those greater Key of Solomon runes, and they omit that step altogether, and that's absolutely fine. But like I said, you can find all of those consecration ceremonies. They're very simple in the Witch's Primer handout. Now, there's another video also that you can find on YouTube, and I will link it with this, that shows you an alternate way of consecrating your Athame, because the Athame is a lot more, it's got a lot more going on to it. It's a lot more involved. It's having you reforge it in fire and then magnetize the blade. That's not something that all blades can withstand. So I've got an alternate for doing that if you don't want to or can't use the traditional one. And so I will put the link to that video as well in the video description in this video. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back with lesson 3 next week. Until then, blessed be.